The fourth tarot card, the Emperor. The fourth tarot card is called the Emperor. It agrees with the letter Daleth, which as we have seen is both the womb of nature or the rejuvenated earth fructified by the sun that it may bring forth, and is also the offspring or that which is brought forth. This fourth card expresses the same symbology in that here we find the active aspect of all that the third card expressed in passivity. Here we see a man seated upon a cubic stone, on one side of which is carved an eagle with outstretched wings. The stone is the square foundation stone which must be established both in the individual and humanity ere the emperor can take his seat and rule his domain. The fact that he is seated indicates that he is established, at rest and ruling in the midst of the four winds, the position of his legs forming the figure 4 or the completion of the foundation, the establishment of man on the earth plane. The eagle is the power of sex uplifted or Scorpio transformed. The eagle as a symbol of one of the four cardinal signs indicates freedom and aspiration, the true freedom which has risen out of the limitations of sex and drawn its creative force from the sun. That it is engraved on the cubic stone indicates that only where man and nature are squared can the spiritual sun become the creator. Only when the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven 4 square will we find no night there, for the law of thy good shall be the light thereof. The scepter bearing the sign of Venus 9, which the emperor holds in his right hand, symbolizes his ability to rule both the force within himself and within his empire, the world, through the Venus power of love. Being held in his right hand shows that it is the active, vivifying principle that is being used. In his left hand he holds a globe surmounted by a balanced cross, symbolizing that it is through the power of the balanced cross that he rules. Also, being held in his left hand shows that only through the feminine power of love can he balance spirit and matter and gain the power to rule the globe. The emperor is bearded, and upon his head is a helmet containing 12 points. This is man's crown of life, subject however at this fourth step to the forces operating through the 12 signs of the zodiac. The fourth commandment. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Genesis 2:2-3. Since the study of numbers reveals the fact that 4 is the number of the physical plane, of stability, of the foundation stone upon which our spiritual structure must be reared, we are not surprised to find the fourth commandment dealing with the seventh day, whose ruling planet, Saturn, is the planet which expresses the characteristics of number 4. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. Exodus 20:8. We might well expect the fourth commandment to apply solely to man's physical well-being. Yet while its literal interpretation is valuable as an hygienic measure, its meaning cannot be relegated entirely to the physical plane, for it has correspondences on all planes. The seventh or Sabbath day, the day of rest after the 6 days of labor, should not be confused with the first day of the week's activities, Sunday, the Lord's Day. It is a misunderstanding of terms and a desire to exalt the day appointed for worship in the new dispensation that has led the Christians to combine the day of rest with the first day, their day of worship, while the Jews adhere to the seventh day. The term Sabbath is derived from the Hebrew word for rest, Shabbath, a day that was observed in commemoration of the day on which God rested after the 6 days of creation, i.e., the seventh day. In the Gospels, the term Sabbath always indicates the seventh or day of rest, the Lord's Day remaining quite distinct until the 3rd century. The dictionary tells us that, in the Middle Ages, Sabbath always meant Saturday. According to the Elder Disraeli, it was first used in England for Sunday in 1554. And since we know that the 6 days of creation are symbols for 6 vast evolutionary periods, so must we look for a symbolic meaning for the 6 days of labor. Each day of the week has its characteristic powers, forces, and significances which should be observed. These are quite as distinct as the forces manifesting during the various seasons, and vary according to the characteristics of the planetary deity ruling the day. In the 4th commandment, we are dealing with the day of rest after the 6 days of activity, Saturday or Saturn's day. In one aspect, Saturn is the same as Cronus or time, and is represented by a serpent swallowing its tail. Saturn is also the ruler who represents stability, repose, rest, and also form. If we remember that Saturn is spoken of as Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, we will see at once that the 1st and 7th days represent the 2 extremes of the same force, or the head and tail of the serpent, which must meet to close the cycle or circle. Time ultimately brings about a literal, although often perverted, manifestation of every symbol and esoteric truth. And as we draw toward the close of this present cycle, we find in the Western world the meaning of the 7th day literally swallowed up in that of the 1st. But both are necessary if we would progress. The serpent needs a tail as well as a head if we are to lift it up into a rod of power. If the head is allowed to swallow the tail, it indicates lack of progress, for it forms a closed circuit around and around which we will circle perpetually. But if both head and tail have their proper places, we can lift up the serpent's head and form a spiral, along which we can enter a higher plane and a new day of experience and expression. The Sun's Day, or the Lord's Day, is the day in which the Lord or Lof sends forth the divine light of the one God into manifestation. This must be preceded by Saturn's Day, both because the O must precede the one, and because the quality of poise, rest and stability must have manifested in the O ere the creative dot could appear and attract around itself the materials from which the one was to manifest and evolve the universe. Being the Sun's Day, the 1st day of the week should be sacred to letting the light shine, to active effort to correlate or establish our oneness with the divine ray of the one God which has shed its light into the darkness of our life's orbit, or we should be as active, positive, and potent in this as was the dot in manifesting the one. In other words, the 1st day of the week should not be a day of rest like the 7th, but should be filled with such spiritual and other activities as shall help the light of the one God within us to shine forth, as shall aid the more perfect manifestation of the law of our good. This is our first duty in beginning the 6 days of labor. Saturn is described as the first planetary deity to go forth from the bosom of the infinite, that he might establish the boundaries of the O within which the universe was to manifest, and create the stability upon which the subsequent manifestation might rest and upon which the forces of the other planetary deities might focus to bring about the subsequent evolution. Hence Saturn is called both the initiator and the tester, who determines the degree of stability of our foundation before each advance is attempted. His force will necessarily be the last to return because the laws of stability must be maintained until the dot has evolved through the gamut of all the numbers and has expanded to the limits of the O and fulfilled its cycle of manifestation. The command to rest and acquire stability is therefore an imperative and fundamental law of every form of manifestation, for it represents the completion of a certain phase or cycle of activity. Just as God rested on the seventh day and contemplated all that Pi had created and saw that it was very good, so must we in a corresponding way, for there is but the one law back of all creation, have a period of rest, silence, and meditation at the close of each cycle of activity. This rest must not be merely a change of occupation, but must be a period of cessation from all outward activity, a holy calm, a sacred meditation, during which we contemplate all that we have created during our 6 days of activity. This period of rest and self-examination should be observed not only at the close of each week, but at the close of each day and at the close of each year. It should not be filled with sighs and regrets over our failures and shortcomings, but should be filled with a high resolve and an earnest determination to create more perfect manifestations during the ensuing period of activity. And this rest, meditation, recuperation, and earnest determination will prepare us for the activities of the Lord's day, i.e., positive, spiritual creation. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the 7th day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. On the Sabbath day not only should we rest from outer activity, gather up the experiences, ratify all that is good in them and build their force into soul growth, but we are commanded not to allow any of our creations to work. Our sons and daughters here symbolize the creations of our positive and negative aspects of thought. The manservant and maidservant symbolize the positive and negative acts or work of our hands which serve or accomplish for us. The cattle refer to the lower animal self with all its attendant animal desires. All these are good, useful, even necessary, and should be fed, cared for, trained, and used in their proper field of activity for the general well-being of the household. But upon the 7th day or period of completion upon which the soul enters, all these animal desires, as well as our sons, daughters, and servants, must rest or cease their activities. Thy stranger within thy gates refers to all those outside influences which sway or influence us. They are the thought forces and opinions of the community, for instance, which to a certain extent we must admit within the gates of our consciousness during the 6 days of labor. If we are to be a positive influence for good in our community and be centers of love, peace, and harmony in our environment, we must pay a certain amount of attention to the conventionalities and entertain as guests or strangers, according to the rules of our household, our standards of life and conduct, the ideals and thought forces which we must admit within our gates. In other words, we must practice tolerance without subservience. The strangers within our gates do not receive the same treatment as the sons and daughters or the servants and cattle, nor are we responsible for them to the same extent, only for the way we entertain them. On this 7th or Saturn's day, therefore, we must see to it that all these activities of our household shall cease. In other words, by the time we have reached our Sabbath, or the 7th great cycle of our manifestation, and in a lesser degree at the close of each 6 days of activity, We should have been able to so correlate with the force of Saturn that we have established a place of peace, of stability and rest, a firm foundation upon which to stand and meet Saturn in his aspect of the tester, so that we can stand still, poised, undismayed and at rest while the creations of our 6 periods of activity are being scanned, weighed, and judged. When we have attained this point in our development, Saturn is no longer the grim tester and reaper, but is the initiator who shall admit us into a higher world of consciousness. The first step is to follow the 4th commandment and observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, in our outer as well as in our inner lives, and prepare for active worship on the Lord's day. Man has 5 physical senses and has 5 corresponding days in which to exercise, labor with, develop and satisfy them, and thus gather all their lessons for the real self. But there are 2 higher senses which man as yet has not developed, which correspond to the days which precede and succeed the 5 days of activity. Man can reach his great Sabbath or period of perfect rest and stability only when he has developed these 2 senses. But to develop them he must follow the rules laid down and arrange for definite periods of rest, relaxation, silence, and meditation. All growth and development proceeds in rhythmic ebb and flow or cyclic periods of activity and inactivity, day and night, summer and winter, etc. Saturn's day is the period of rest at the turn of the tide. Like the boundaries of the O, it sets limits to the periods of activity. It is like the arm of God reached out to force all things to observe periods of rest, as the night forces us to cease from physical labor, for without it all would soon become exhausted. The positive aspect of the life force cannot be absorbed, whether from our food or in other ways, while the organism is tense in active work. All is then expression, giving out, it even being injurious to work directly after a hearty meal. Therefore, to renew our forces for another period of activity, a period of relaxation and rest is a vital necessity. At some time during our cycles of manifestation, even in the minor cycle of day and night, we must enter the silence and renew our forces. If we refuse to do so voluntarily, say by remaining awake and active during night periods, we will soon lose our life forces, and ultimately great Saturn will compel us to enter upon a period of inactivity that is so long that the organism from which we have withdrawn cannot maintain itself, and we, therefore, call this period of enforced rest and silence physical death. On the contrary, when we have mastered the silence and acquired its power, when we are able to keep the Sabbath day holy, we can renew our life forces, revivify and recreate our bodies periodically little by little, and not be obliged to take the longer period of rest, and to recreate an entire new body in another incarnation. Through voluntarily entering the silence and properly applying its forces, we can gradually change the outer personality so that it will continually express our stage of spiritual unfoldment. At a corresponding period, the personality would therefore be quite as different and express quite as great spiritual advance as though we had been forced to leave it and take our rest in the grave and then built up a new body. In other words, if we properly correlate with Saturn through the silence and conquer him as the grim reaper, we can remain incarnate cycle after cycle by recreating the organism in accordance with the necessities of each new period. In fact, this is actually done by those who have entered the higher stages of mastery and developed the 2 higher faculties, yet who still desire to retain a physical vehicle. But of course, to one who has attained such control of the life forces, the mere possession of a physical body does not confine him to the physical plane, nor does it make the flesh an earthly prison house. This is the great truth back of the doctrine of regeneration and immortality in the flesh. The Sabbath day, therefore, means a period in which we are to rest, meditate, and enter into oneness with all creation. To vibrate in unison with all planes of manifestation, to commune with the one God, the union with whom is the object of our evolution. Therefore, the law blesses this period and hallows it or makes it holy, for it enables us to enter into oneness with the whole.